The time is upon us, and thank you for coming back. I know I appreciate you keep coming back. We're moving on to our second church today. Our first church that we did last week was Ephesus, and we concluded that the message from John, Jesus speaking through John of Patmos, was that Ephesus had become a church of loveless orthodoxy. And there was a desire to change that. And so today we go to Smyrna, which is on your map. I handed out just so you can see where it is. It's just kind of north of Ephesus, if you see. It's up there, and it also is on the ocean, and was a big city with boats coming in and out, especially in the time of the Greeks. But Smyrna, just so you know, is kind of interesting because it actually is known as the city of Izmir today, which is a big city. So you might have heard of that place. I know when I was there, our tour guide kind of said, you know, Izmir has a reputation as being a city that kind of likes to do its own thing. And he said, you know, we have all these clerics, these Muslim clerics who tell us rules and what to do. And Izmir kind of goes, we're going to do our own thing. So he said he was kind of proud of that. He said, you know, Izmir is kind of a city that does their own thing. But it's, the last statistics I could find was for December 2019. But the city of Izmir had a population of 2,965,900. And so that was the city. The province, because they have, you know, kind of some suburbs or some things on the outside, actually had a population of 4,367,251. So if you kind of say the area of the population was over 4 million, that gives you an idea of the city. It also gives you an idea that as we go visiting, thinking about the churches, what you can imagine is that Izmir is built upon the old city of Smyrna. Right? So Ephesus, which was wonderful because you could walk through and they had them dug down and you could see the whole city, and you could walk through the whole city and it was all the ruins. Izmir's, you can't, because it's a new city that's been built on the old city. They have a couple of things that they've excavated that you can see, but it just gives you an idea that, you know, the new city was built upon the old, so there's probably a lot underneath there, but right now there's not a lot we can see. So that's why I don't have pictures for you this week, because mostly it's just of the new city. But that just kind of gives you a little bit of background of the city. So let's go ahead and look at, like we did last week, and that's why I kind of say to you, I kind of laugh when they say this is the sermon to the churches, because this one is, you know, just 3 verses. So it's not, maybe it's a sermon you wish I would give every Sunday, but so will somebody read us the Smyrna, the message to the Smyrna church, which is 2:8 through 11, and it's on your paper, but if somebody will read that for me, that would be great.
I'll read. What am I reading, this one right here?
Yes. Oh, wait, is that the Smyrna? No, that's it. Yeah, the Smyrna. Yeah.
And to the angel of the church in Smyrna write, these are the words of the first and the last, who was dead and came to life. I know your affliction and your poverty, even though you are rich. I know the slander on the part of those who say that they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not fear what you are about to suffer. Beware, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison so that you may be tested. And for 10 days you will have affliction. Be faithful until death, and I will give you the crown of life. Let anyone who has an ear listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. Whoever conquers will not be harmed by the second death.
All right, thank you. So that one's as clear as mud, right? You got it all figured out. So let's go through our form of the letters. Remember, they all start with a Christ title or a Christ statement. So what is the statement about Christ here? Yeah, the first and the last, right? Very much taken, and you know, I told you, and you'll kind of see as we go through this, how many times John connects to the Hebrew Bible, to the Old Testament, which is why they said, you know, he very much considered himself still a person connected to the Jewish faith, right? And the Alpha and Omega very much comes from, you know, Isaiah, chapters 41, 44, 48, where God is the first and the last, the Alpha and Omega, and then Christ takes on those titles through the Gospels. But it really is this concept of God is the God of the whole history, you know, of everything. And I often, like when I do confirmation class with teenagers, we often try to do a timeline of the Bible, because a lot of them have heard Bible stories, but they don't know where to put them in terms of the Bible story. And so we'll kind of do a big timeline, and they'll shout out a story, and then they'll draw it. I'll tell them where to draw it so they can kind of see. But basically, once we kind of get these Bible stories in some kind of context, I'll kind of say, well, what does this law say? And I say, well, you know, to me it just says God was there at the very beginning, God will be there at the end, and God is there everywhere in the middle. Right? So it's kind of this first and last statement that Christ shares in this image of God from Isaiah as the first and the last. And that's something, and we'll be talking a little bit more. You heard Julie read about the statement about the people who think they're Jews but are not. So the idea of what does it mean to be Jewish and what does it mean to be a follower of Christ is very important in this note. So we'll be talking a little bit about that more later. But the other thing, you know, that they say about Christ, which is important, is was dead and came to life. Right? So a resurrection statement. But you can see as you look at the end of this passage, that was important when he talks about, well, the second death. That these folks felt very much that might be an option for them, the first death. So the idea of saying, hey, Christ was dead and came back to life is one of offering hope and a resurrection statement about Christ. And so the images, and this is what's wonderful about John of Patmos, is these images he uses of Christ really speak to the church he's talking to what issues they're talking about, right? He's saying to Smyrna, God is there for the whole, for the beginning to the end, God is there, and Jesus is the resurrection. The Alpha and the Omega, yeah, that's the same thing, the beginning and the end, right? So next is the commendation. Remember, so what is the church doing well? So I know your affliction and your poverty, even though you are rich, which we might go to those seem to oppose each other. I know the slander on the part of those who say they're Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. So affliction, the church is undergoing affliction, a word that often is used in Revelation as a time of crisis and catastrophe, or a climax of history. So the angel is saying, I know this is a difficult time, right? And we said often that Elaine Pagels, you know, the theologian at Princeton, said, you know, she really felt that John was writing Revelation to respond to two questions. And one is, how do you remain faithful when it seems like the whole rest of the world is kind of coming apart, right? And why hasn't Jesus come yet? So you know, the commendation is, oh, okay, you all are doing well. In time of crisis, catastrophe, you know, you all are holding up. So good job. Poverty. There's some indication here this might be pointing to the fact that as people come out as followers of the way, that is something that's unique and distinct and different, that there might be those who do not go to churches' businesses because they don't want to support their religious entity. And part of this, and this we'll talk about in a little bit, but part of this, in the pagan culture, very much they understood that if there were times where a god, because usually they had a god for each city, you know, so that if there were some in their community who were not praying to the god of the city, it was their fault if the city experienced difficulties, right? So there was a lot of pressure that, you know, if you all were gathering and praying to the God of the city, but if there were a couple people over here who weren't, then you're the cause of the city's problems, right? And so you're going to be blamed. And so people don't want to sponsor your businesses. People don't want to interact with you. They blame you for some of the things that are going on, right? So very much this idea of poverty might be that if somebody became a follower of the way, they truly might be folks who have a hard time making a living, because people will blame them for what doesn't go right with the city. Right, so that's a very real sense for the people here. Slander is another one. And so this is where it's important for us to understand the Jewish population of Smyrna. One thing we know, there was a bishop, Polycarp, who was a bishop of Smyrna, years after this was written, but we think he had an overlap or a connection with John of Patmos, or the Apostle John, as we kind of, you know, tradition kind of puts them together. What we know is that Polycarp was martyred in 155 CE, okay? And we know that he was arrested and charged with inciting citizens not to sacrifice to the gods, right? So this goes back to our thing of people, if you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing for the gods of Smyrna, then you're causing the city harm, right? So he was arrested because he wasn't making sacrifices. And city officials felt sorry for this 86-year-old man and encouraged him to just say Caesar is Lord, right? Just say it. Just say it and we'll let you go, right? Just do it. And that will avoid any torture or any death. And Polycarp refused, and the angry mob gathered sticks for burning. And so the whole angry mob gathered, and here's the thing, it was on the Sabbath, it was on a Saturday, and there were some Jews who were part of the burning. So part of the statement against Jews and those who say they were not might be a critique of those who would participate in something like this. Right, a statement of, wait a minute, if you say that's your faith, but you're burning somebody, you know, are you really following what your tradition says? What tradition says his quote was that 86 years I have served Christ, and he never did me any harm. How then can I blaspheme my king who saved me? So that's what tradition says Polycarp says, and he was martyred. So we kind of put this idea of blasphemy by the synagogue of Satan, those people who are Jews and who think they are not. And we need to kind of understand, so we have this sense of initially slander, right? And Jews who say they are and are not. And here's the thing that's interesting about this statement, and again, it goes back to how does John of Patmos understand himself? You get the idea here when he says those who say they are Jews who are not, is that, that John actually respects those who say that they are Jews and that they are, right? He's not mad at those who are Jews who are following the Jewish way. He's mad at those who are pretending to be Jews, right? So it's kind of a distinct, so you kind of go, well, okay, so then who is he talking about? And so the term Jew here is positive in terms of he doesn't have criticism against the Jews. He has criticism against those who say they're Jews and are not. We also have here, which is interesting, which Julie read very well, is our first introduction of Satan into Revelation. And Satan has more of a role in Revelation than in any of the New Testament writings. And so Satan and the devil are interchangeable in Revelation. But this is the idea of kind of this big entity. And the one thing, if you read through the Gospels, Satan is there and causing problems, but not as powerful as Satan is described in Revelation. Satan in Revelation is almost as powerful as God and is fighting and is challenging. Satan in the Gospels is an annoyance. He shows up, he causes problems, but is not, on the same level as God. So it's interesting to kind of see that grow in Revelation. So let's look a little bit about this idea of what is it that is so disconcerting about this idea of those who say they're Jews that are not, and this idea of battles and what's going on here in this letter. So let's just go a little bit and take a little bit of this idea into some of the history to give us some background. Part of the debate, again, among the scholars is there was a Jewish community called these Essenes, and this was a community who was adamant about following the Jewish rules and laws, that they actually felt that the temple had been defamed, or the temple had been that had been defiled. And so they moved out. They said, well, we can't go to the Jewish temple anymore because it's been defiled, and so we're going to move somewhere else. That they also saw themselves very much as ones who were amidst this idea of an actual war that was coming. And there's a debate among the scholarly community, were they preparing for an actual war, or did they mean it in a metaphorical way? And there's a British scholar, Richard Bauckham, who points to the fact that we have copies of their scrolls that talk about the war of the sons of light and sons of darkness, and they have pictures of the final battle between good and evil, so this all kind of seems very much like Revelation. And they actually sketch out war plans, that they have how to station soldiers, what kinds of weapons they need, what distances they need to build latrines. That's a big part of the staying pure, right? You have to have latrines certain distances away. How to bury their dead. They were stockpiling weapons, and they were engaging in military training. So to some degree, there seems to be among this religious community that was very religious, this idea that there was this actual fight and this actual battle. That's a little different, we can see, as John of Patmos goes on with Revelation, because he seems to speak of a holy war where Jesus as the warrior king comes from heaven, that Jesus leads armies of angels, which suggests that God doesn't necessarily need a human army, right? That God's going to send angels to do the fighting. And that John of Patmos is encouraging people to stay pure, to stay connected, to stay religious, to bear witness to God unto death, and then God will take care of the rest. Right? So when we look at this part from Revelation, as he's speaking of this battle with Satan, for John of Patmos, the idea very much, instead of preparing for a military fight, which although Revelation is a battle, the rest of Revelation is going to be a battle. The idea for John is, well, Jesus comes, Jesus brings the armies, you just have to stay focused and pure and keep living the life God called you to, and God will take care of that part. Right? Let's see what else.
Excuse me, did you
Yeah.
say the Essenes were, I heard you say they did not advocate on Jews and laws, but were they for the actual war?
Well, scholars debate that, and that, I quoted the British scholar because he's one who says, no, I think they were actually preparing for war. There are some biblical scholars who say, no, that was more metaphorical. They were kind of talking about this battle that was to come. But I show that up as kind of maybe people debate the two Essenes' way they look at things, and John very much kind of is on the side of, no, our job is not to fight the war, our job is to stay pure, to stay religiously connected, to follow the religious laws, and then God will take care of the rest. Yeah,
The Jews actually had one final war against the Romans.
yeah, and 135.
25.
Yeah. Oh, I thought it was 35, but yeah,
No, Jerusalem was destroyed.
yeah.
The temple's already gone. They did all 11 of the city.
Right, we tend to focus on Rome coming in at 70 and destroying the temple as kind of the final battle. But there still were people who were there who were kind of fighting, Rome. And then I thought it was 135, but it could be 25, but it gives you the idea of the time period. In the early 2nd century, that Rome came in again and destroyed the whole city and did destroy the Essene community, which was near, one of the most famous is near the Dead Sea, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, which is Qumran, which is kind of where we get a lot of our information, because that's where we found some of the scrolls. But that was destroyed, in the early 100s. And so there was a sense of after that was no longer there. Right? So I say that, you may say, Helen, that's a lot of background, do we really need to know that? But part of what John is struggling with, and we'll see this later in Revelation, is, if it is our job to remain pure and remain holy and do our best we can, and let Jesus do the rest of the work, how do we do that? Right? How do you remain pure and how do you remain holy? And what we see with John of Patmos, is that he kind of gets in the same kind of debate that was going on with the early apostles, with Peter and James and with Paul, in terms of the question of, do you have to follow the strict Jewish rules to remain pure? Right? And John of Patmos is going to weigh in on that, because he talks about that there are certain prophets and teachers that are encouraging God's people to eat unclean food. Okay, and to engage in unclean relationships. And we know that was a debate in the very early church with James and Peter and Paul. Okay, and this becomes a big thing. And again, we kind of put it in the context of this society, in that often most of the markets, of the meat markets, if you went to the market to get meat, the meat you would get was meat that was already offered, had been offered to one of the Roman gods. Right? You go and offer it, you say a prayer, well, it stays there for a while, so then you take it and you go to the market and you sell it. Right? And so when folks here and in the other, in Paul's letters are talking about what does it mean to eat unclean food, the question is, do you defile yourself if you're eating meat that was sacrificed to another god? Right? And Paul gets to the point, he kind of says, I don't think it does, but if the person sitting next to you thinks it does, then you should honor the person next to you and not eat it, so that they aren't tempted to fall away. He says he doesn't believe it's the actual act, but he says, but I know there are people who believe that. So to honor those, to help them not to fall away, that would be something that would be important. What we know about John is he's very concerned about this, right? So it gets back to the question of, do you have to be Jewish and follow all the Jewish laws in order to be Christian, right? I mean, that's kind of the debate. Do you need to do all those things? Yes?
What about the timing? Just a word about the timing. These letters were written in 80 to 120 AD. And the Gospels were written a little bit earlier, not a lot. Paul's issues in his letters were much earlier than all of that. And in the Gospels, we have Jesus saying, here's a resolution to your issue. It's not what you take in that defiles you, it's what you spit out that defiles you. And that seems to be speaking to the issue of Peter, Paul, and John. So it's interesting to see that timeline and how that all plays together. The gospel is trying to settle some of the issues that were in those early churches.
It also speaks to how hard it is to change a tradition, right? And if we say, this, and we may kind of laugh, or not laugh, but kind of go, why was that such a big deal? And one of the things we need to remember and know is that for the Jewish people, this was a whole part of what made them who they were, right? And they were very clear that they were different from the other communities. And they were very clear, and we kind of forget because we're so used to monotheism kind of being the main thing, right? But the Jews were very distinct and unique in being a monotheistic world, right? So they were part of their thing of this is how we're different, this is how we're known, this is how we declare what we believe, was how they ate and circumcision and their Sabbath. I mean, these were all markers, and so there was some sense of one reason to hold on to those so tight was because for a long time, those were the things they felt kept them strong when they had all sorts of outside groups that, that they fought with and caused harm, and they lost sometimes and they won sometimes. But it was this sense of that kind of helped them define who they were. Yeah.
Obviously, the Christians would not sacrifice to the emperor. The Jews wouldn't either. So why weren't they being persecuted like the Christians were?
Well, and this is the thing we do know, because this had been so much a part of the Jewish history, that Rome and Greek, the Greeks really kind of gave them a pass. They kind of said, okay, we understand, and they kind of had this sense of, okay, any other place we go, we establish our temples and we expect people to worship there. We kind of know the Jews won't. And they're kind of, there was a big battle in 163-ish, I might be getting my date wrong, BC, when the Jews kicked out the Greeks. And they kicked them out because they were building a temple to Zeus on the Temple Mount. And they were doing, and this was like, no, you don't do that. And so there was a sense of the Jewish people will fight back for that. And so to some degree, Rome said, we'll give you a pass. If you're Jewish, we understand you're not gonna sacrifice. Which that becomes an issue then. Are the Christians just an offshoot of the Jews? Which some Christians want, because then they say, well, Rome, you can't come after us because we're just like the Jews. We're not gonna sacrifice to your gods. Or are they another group? Which at that point, the Christians don't have the bypass that the Jews did. And that was, you didn't know it, but you really were leading to a good, a good question. Because one of the things or the thoughts is, those who say they are Jews and are not, might be John speaking to those who have joined the followers of the way, but who have come from a pagan background. So if they come from a pagan background, it makes it hard for John, because John is sticking with the Jewish tradition, right? Hey guys, you need to follow the Jewish tradition. And if those who come from a pagan background are coming and saying, well, we're Christians, but they haven't gone through all the things that they need to do to actually be Jewish. But if they are being targeted by the Romans because they are no longer sacrificing to the gods, so the Romans won't target the Jews because they had never sacrificed to the gods, so it's not a big deal. But if all of a sudden there's a group who had sacrificed to the gods and all of a sudden stop, and this gets back to what our concern was at the beginning, that if you as a community say, hey, you stop sacrificing, and we haven't had rain for a year or two, and it's your fault. The gods are mad at you. So you need to go back and restore your relationship to the gods for the good of the community. Right? But if they say, well, we're Christian now, and they say, no, only the Jews have that bypass, not you. Right? The other thing that happens and that becomes part of this, and we see this a little bit in Paul's writings. Again, because Paul does kind of address this idea of, do you need to eat kosher or not? Do you need to eat what is considered clean by the Jewish tradition? But there also becomes, as part of this debate, right, do you need to be Jewish or not? And it begins in Paul's time, but it definitely is present with John. We see it kind of come to fruition with John, is there is a sense of some of the folks who are coming from a pagan background, who kind of come and say, oh no, we don't need to be Jewish, we don't need to follow those rules. We as Christians have taken over the idea of the chosen people. And for John, and we know this of John of Patmos, he says, no, the Jews are the chosen people. He says, you cannot say that you have taken that over. Right? So he's very adamant that you can't just say you've stepped in and taken on that role. That role has been designated, it goes to the Jewish people. And so part of the debate with John, of those who claim they're Jews that are not, is that we see during this time period that there are some who kind of come in and kind of want to wash the kind of Jewish concept away. And John's saying, no, you can't do that, because he very much, it's important to him to continue the Jewish traditions. And so that's who people think that John is talking about when he says the people who say they are Jews and are not. Right? You are the ones who now say you're the chosen people. Well, you're not. You're not Jews. You're not the chosen people. Right? And that's why he has such a hard stance against them. You're the synagogue of Satan. Right? Because you're not following those rules at all. One of the reasons we think that, as we kind of argue or kind of consider this in our minds, is that Elaine Pagels, I told you, the author from Princeton, her book about Revelation, and she says she doesn't think that John considers himself Christian, but a Jewish person who's a follower of the way. Right? And so she says that's kind of a different interpretation. Because what she argues is that John's language and themes indicate that he's Jewish, that he follows the tradition of James and Peter and Paul, who do not see themselves as leaving Judaism, that all of them continue to worship in the synagogues, right, until some of them kicked them out, but they continue to worship at the synagogues. But they saw themselves as Jews who acknowledged Jesus as the Messiah. What we know is kind of that Roman magistrates, or what scholars guess, coined the term Christian to refer to Gentiles who aroused the suspicion of treason against Rome because they stopped worshiping the gods. So that might have been a category that was kind of put on them by the Romans. What we know is around the year 112, one governor in Asia Minor discovered something suspicious. Okay, so this is evidence we have from 112. And this governor said people in his region had stopped worshiping the gods after they joined the cult devoted to Jesus of Nazareth. And he had them arrested, and like other magistrates, called them Christians. He reported to the emperor what he had learned while interrogating and torturing 2 women slaves. He wrote that the accused often met early in the morning to pray to Jesus as a god, and that even when facing the death penalty, some had refused to pour a cup of wine to honor the gods or the emperor's statues. While admitting that, I do not know, this is a quote we have from him, I do not know whether they were guilty of other criminal acts. Pliny, and this is the governor, explained that he had sent them off to be executed, deciding that because of their obstinacy alone, they well deserved it. Right, so we know this is an issue. This would only come to the attention of the magistrates if the people who had previously worshipped pagan gods had stopped. Right, again, because they didn't really pay attention to the Jewish people. So these are people who would watch the pagan gods and stopped. The Jews were kind of considered atheists because they didn't worship the pagan gods, so they were kind of left alone. So the argument is that these folks wouldn't have come to the attention of the Romans if they hadn't been worshiping the gods initially and then had changed their behavior. So let's see what else. By the time John of Patmos traveled in Asia Minor, he found many followers of Paul who assumed that Gentiles had now become Israel and replaced the Jews. And so that John of Patmos was kind of writing against that, and was angry at that. And so we have one example of somebody who did that. Okay, so this is kind of, I know this is a lot of history, but it's to kind of give you an idea of what things John of Patmos might have been speaking against. You may have heard of Ignatius, St. Ignatius of Antioch and Syria. And he was the first person we know who aggressively called himself a Christian to distinguish himself. He did it intentionally to distinguish himself from the Jews. He was converted to Paul's message about 80 to 90 CE. So this gives us timing. 20 to 30 years after, Paul already was dead, but he was converted to his message. He took Paul's message to heart and took Paul as a model for his own life. He called himself the Christ bearer. And I like that title. I think that's a wonderful title for us to think about. Are we Christ bearers? Like John, he wrote 7 letters to 7 churches near the coast, including 3 of the churches that John wrote to: Ephesus, Smyrna, and Philadelphia. Like John, Ignatius identified with people who suffered persecution. Eventually, he would declare himself a Christian before a Roman magistrate. So at this point in time, he's standing up, and he'd be consigned to be torn apart by wild animals in a public spectacle at the Roman Colosseum in 110. He had a different picture of who God's people were than John. This is St. Ignatius. Okay? So both Ignatius and John lived 2 generations after Jesus' death. Both were pressed to say who should succeed Jesus, and they both answered that differently. John envisioned Jesus' followers as outposts of Israel, while divinely being guided by angels and being listening to prophets like himself. Ignatius adopted what Paul thought, that God had appointed leaders as apostles first and prophets second. So unlike John, who saw himself as a prophet, Ignatius saw himself as a supervisor, okay, or a bishop. Nothing less than the bishop of Syria, as if he were the sole leader of all Christians in Syria. When some people accused him of acting as if he were an apostle, he replied indignantly that I am not giving orders like an apostle, but he claimed to be one of their successors. So this is where we kind of get the idea of passing that on. Ignatius was the first we know to actively promote and represent this new system of leadership. Writing to Jesus' followers in Asia Minor, Ignatius insisted that every real church must have a bishop as well as priests and deacons. So he's really getting into having a setup for the church. John of Patmos never mentions bishops at all. The only apostle whom John reveres are the 12 apostles of the Lamb, whom he envisioned in heaven. When John hears people are promoting themselves as apostles in Ephesus, if you remember last week, he responds with alarm. So we don't know if Ignatius knew about John and or John's writings, but we do know that he visited Jesus' followers in Philadelphia, carefully expecting opposition, knowing that they had been famous for its active prophets from time to time. When the apostle Philip's 4 daughters, all prophets, had lived there to the time that John of Patmos was found in Philadelphia, a strong fellowship. Instead of challenging the prophetic authority, Ignatius decided to claim it for himself. While he was worshiping with Jesus' people there, suddenly the Spirit of God came upon him, and he shouted out in worship as inspired prophets did. I cried out when I was with you. I cried out in a loud voice, God's own voice. What Ignatius shouted was what he preached all the time. Pay attention to the bishop, the priest, and the deacons. Right? Ignatius admits that some people who heard him objected, charging that rather than speaking in the Spirit, Ignatius had faked it, having been told in advance that the members of the congregation looked on bishops and priests with suspicion. Ignatius denies that anyone had told him anything and swears by God that, this is his quote, I did not learn this from a human source. It was the Spirit that kept on speaking these words. Do nothing apart from the bishop. Prize unity, avoid schism, imitate Jesus Christ. Interestingly, when he later writes to Philadelphia, he rejects what John and the gospel writers had taken for granted, that what validates faith in Jesus Christ are the scriptures of the Hebrew Bible, especially its prophecies. Yeah.
Now, I assume all this St. Ignatius advocacy is about men as bishops and deacons and priests.
Yes. Yes, you can assume that. That's the way it often goes.
Repeat. She had a microphone.
I'm sorry, she said, could she assume that Ignatius was speaking about men as bishops and prophets? Certainly we today would argue with his thing that that he did not validate the Hebrew Bible, right? And we would point to things like the Gospel of Mark opens with Isaiah's prophecies. Matthew quotes the Old Testament more than any of the other Gospels. And John of Patmos in Revelation certainly ties to the Hebrew Bible. Ignatius hardly ever spoke about the Hebrew Bible. And he told people that the Gospels were the primary source, that you didn't need any other, right? And he said, I have heard some people say, if I don't find it in the primary sources, I don't believe in it what is preached as gospel, right? So he kind of wanted to throw the Hebrew Bible out. But the interesting thing is Ignatius does declare, and this is part of what I think John of Patmos was fighting against, that it is not Judaism but Christianity that now is the chosen people of God. Right? So he's doing this about the same time as John. So I just want you to recognize that there is a movement out there that is kind of in this way. And I think John of Patmos to Smyrna is saying those who call themselves Jews but are not, is speaking about those who think we're Christians now, we replace the Jewish people. So that was more information than you ever wanted to know about St. Ignatius, but it gives you a little bit of background. So that is what we're talking about here as we go to the complaint. So if we talk about that was the commendation, what's the complaint? What is the church doing wrong? Nothing. There's no complaint. And is Charles here? He was working and then he came in. So because he was the one who said, well, what are the ones, Helen? You told us there are a couple who don't have a complaint. There's no complaint. And this is why, it's nice when you know the form that these letters have, because the fact that there's no complaint here kind of makes you sit up and pay attention and go, oh my gosh, that makes a statement, right? That John says Jesus has no complaint about this church. And that'll only be true of one other church. So that's like, okay, Smyrna, you church, you're doing good. So when you look at the corrections, well, we don't have any negative correction, right? Because, the correction is do not fear, right? So it's not necessarily the correction, but it's kind of like how to hang on, right? If there's not a complaint, there's not a correction, but it's the idea of, so in verse 10, he says, do not fear what you're about to suffer. Beware, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison so that you may be tested. And for 10 days you will have affliction. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. So in the Roman world, there were not many prisons. They were expensive. They are expensive to keep up, right? So often if they could, they would put people on house arrest. They would kind of, but to have a prison is something that costs money to keep going. And it was often simpler in the Roman world to kill them. We're not going to pay to have you in prison, we're not going to pay to feed you, we'll just kill you. So if you're thrown into prison, you got to know it's not going to be one where you're cared for well, or you're going to have a lot to eat, or you're going to have a lot of things to think about. 10 days, when they mention 10 days here, it's most likely a reference to Daniel, to the Hebrew Bible Daniel, Daniel and his friends were tested for 10 days. So it's a reference to, it seems like a long time, but it's limited. And that'll kind of be part of our rest of Revelation when we say, well, when is Jesus going to come? And so it's kind of a statement of, yes, it will seem long, you will be tested, but there is an end to it. Hang on, it won't be on forever. And it is also tied to this idea of the first and the last who died and came again. Right? Be faithful until death, but remember, Jesus is the one of the resurrection. So here's a go with the consequences, right? There's no negative consequence because they don't need to change, right? So there's no negative consequence. There's a positive consequence. If you hang in there, if you're faithful until death, I will give you the crown of life. Right? And crown here is probably not like a royal diadem, but more like a wreath, like you would think for the Olympics, kind of a wreath. And it's the idea of this one of nature and nurture and the crown of life and life everlasting and life continuing, right? So don't be afraid if you lose the life here and now, but there will be one for you in the future. So if we're thinking about our tag, as we're doing a tagline for each of these, for Smyrna, we're going to call this the Church of the Persevering Persecuted. So Smyrna, the letter really kind of is hang in there. You're doing good. Hang in there and don't think that others are going to displace you. Thoughts, comments, questions? I know I threw a lot at you today. Yeah, Dan.
This may way be off base, but it seems to me we have two ways of identifying faith communities. One is a spirit-filled, and you follow that, and Ignatius does that, and then you put in bishops, etc. On the other hand, John says, no, you've got to look at the legitimacy of our history to authenticate a faith community. We still have this diversity today. I know it's exaggerated to say the Pentecostal movement plus the Presbyterian, but I mean, there are those beginning to evolve different ways of understanding what it means to be a faith community.
Yeah, I think you're right. And one of the struggles is, and I think, as we kind of laugh about Ignatius, but part of his thing, if John is speaking to people who are saying, why hasn't Jesus come yet, and trying to figure out what are you supposed to do, Ignatius is at least trying to put in some guidelines. Well, okay, he hasn't come yet, so let's get things set up. Let's prepare. How do we handle this? How do we get the church, set and kind of have something in motion and have, so even if we don't like the rules, there is some sense of Ignatius kind of having maybe more of a future plan, which means, okay, Christ hasn't come yet, what are we going to do? We're going to kind of set up to be able to be here longer. And Paul says that in his first letter or second letter to the Thessalonians, that he complains about those who say, oh, Christ's going to come, I'm just going to sit down, I don't have to do anything. Right? And so Ignatius is somebody saying, no, he hasn't come yet, so we're going to set it up, and we're going to set up the church, and we're going to get going. And I think, there's some sense of forward looking in that. You got to be, like all of us, it's a warning to us, you got to be careful that sometimes you might hold that up and forget the background that got you there. And his kind of wanting to put the Hebrew Bible aside might be one that kind of leaves that behind. And so I think you're right, it's kind of something as we look at and see, we talked, I think last week, our loveless orthodoxy of the Ephesians, we could think about examples of how we might see that come out, in our world today. The persevering persecuted, we might want to think about where where would this message go today? Who are the people that this message would go to today? Yeah.
The persecuted, persevering persecuted, kind of speaks to an issue that was going on in the early church as well with regard to, in order to save my life, I'm going to deny that I'm Christian. But when the pressure's off, I want me back to part of the church. And there was judgment about that. You gave it up to save your life, but I persevered. And there's a distinction about who's the better member of the congregation, who's more worthy of the congregation. And the congregation had a name to it. That's important. But it was that issue with the dynamic going on in the early church that this seems to, the Nathan especially, seems to try to address.
And what David was saying is that it certainly sets up a question about a time where people hang in there and keep doing and saying they're Christian and standing up for that, and others maybe who say, well, I am, but I'll be quiet. I don't want to be in trouble. I'll just kind of wait till it passes. And so how do those two different people find a way to be together again? And I might say, to some degree, I think we have something of that these days where people can't, it seems, can't have a differing opinion, right? Can you share your opinion? If you're with a group and you're the only one opinion, are you going to share it or not? Is it better to be quiet? Does it do anything? But then you also say, well, it takes people to stand out and if they think something's wrong and kind of make a motion for it. And I mean, to me, our big, whether you agree or not, but I think one of the big questions is Liz Cheney, who spoke out and said she felt something was wrong, she was going to stand up for it, she was going to do something, and she was voted out of her seat. So that there's a sense of when do you stand up and what you might have you have as a consequence. And certainly that wasn't necessarily a religious thing, but I think, from what I understand from her, that was very much for her a statement about what she felt her faith led her to do. But so it is a comment about how do we find ways, do we, to stand up for something we believe, even if it's hard. And it's a question. I think it's hard today. But I also think, and this is, we do this on All Saints Sunday, is that we recognize that we often stand on those who have stood up before us, right? So how do we do that? And how do we do that in a powerful way? I don't know. There's a great movie about apartheid in South Africa with Denzel Washington and Kevin Kline, and I'm forgetting it now, but Denzel Washington played a person in the 60s, 70s who was kind of telling the world about apartheid and his experience as a black man, what it was like to be there. And he eventually was killed. But that was what let the world know that apartheid was there. And we may not remember his name, Stephen Biko. We may not know his name very much today, but because he stood up and did that, we learned and eventually change came, right? But that's not easy. That's hard. That's really hard. So it's kind of a challenge as we look around our world today.
I also thought of, next weekend is September 11th. We lived in New Jersey. We lost a number of people in our community. But it was just horrendous to hear a person like, I won't name it, but a religious person saying that this has happened because we have failed to keep the laws of God as written in the Old Testament. And it was just horrendous to hear that. When we're grieving the loss of a person's or a community. But you pointed out that that's what the people in Smyrna were going through, being accused of brought this famine, this poverty upon us. because you have not been faithful to our gods. Same issue.
Really good point, the sense of sometimes people blaming hard times on folks who haven't lived correctly, whatever that is and however that's been defined. I mean, I don't know, I remember Katrina. There were some who said, oh, well, New Orleans deserved it because they're just this crazy place. But certainly 9/11 coming up next week, there was this sense of people saying, well, you know, was that some wrath of God? And I tend to, and again, it kind of goes back to how we understand God. I don't think God necessarily plans that. I don't think God planned or wanted difficulty for the church in Smyrna. I think that's part of what we do to ourselves. But I think God's message to us is hang in there, hold on, keep going, you know, do what you know is right, and that God's will come out in the end. But I don't, and I know I'll say this in my sermon, but I have a really, really hard time with the prosperity gospel, which has become a thing in our world today, which is the idea that some pastors promote that, well, if you just become Christian and are baptized and you believe, then everything will be fine. And I read these things and I'm like, no, that's not what I get. I get this idea of, yeah, it may be difficult, but I'll be with you. Hang in there, right? I don't get the, well, if you just believe, life will be easy for you and you won't have any struggles. You know, that isn't the way I understand Scripture. So, you know, I think that's something for us as a church to acknowledge, because there are some who kind of say, oh, well, you know, if I just believe, everything will be easy. And I'm like, I don't think that's, what? The way I want it, yeah. And I'm like, you know, Jesus said, take up my cross and follow me. You know, take up your cross and follow me. And you know, and so many examples. And the example today of, you know, being a disciple isn't necessarily easy, but God helps you and walks you through it. And life, not being a Christian, is not necessarily easy, but heck, I hope it's easier to make it with God beside you than God's not, right? Or if God can help to direct you when you're confused and don't know about a situation. You know, if you're kind of like, oh gosh, then maybe some of your religious training can give you some background. You know, I mean, those kinds of things. But that doesn't mean you're going to get everything you want. And I think that's something we need to help folks understand in terms of how we understand faith. Because I think that's different than some of our other brothers and sisters who might believe a little differently. All right. Well, we'll be on to church number 3 next week.